Okay, so I want to now focus on the while loop, which is another construct that allows us to iterate or loop over arrays and to also repeat tasks. So the while loop does the same thing as the for loop. However, as you will see, it does it in a slightly different manner with a slightly different syntax. So we have been using the for loop, and we have the three parts, right, where we create the box or the variable. We have a condition, and then we have a increment. Okay, and then of course inside we have an action or a set of actions that need to be performed. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. And if we look down here, we'll notice that we have the box being created outside. So we would say int I0. And then on the next line, we would use the while keyword. Okay, so it's no longer for, it's while. And then we have the condition or the test. And then we have the curly braces as usual. And we have the actual action, which is to print the item. In addition to the action, we have to add the increment. Okay, so whatever actions you have, the last action should be to do the increment. So if you look at it from this point of view, step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4, like I mentioned in the previous video or in previous videos, if we now look at the while loop, okay, we notice that step 1 is here, okay, step 2 is here, step 3 is here, and step 4 is here. And again, similar to the for loop, we only do step 1 once. Okay, so once we create the box, we never do that again. So inside the while loop, similar to the for loop, we will test. Okay, so is 0 less than 2? That's true. And if it's true, then we print out the item. In this case, it would print Ben. And then the last thing is to add 1 to I. Okay, the increment. So I out here will become 1. And then of course we'll go back directly to the test, step 2. And we'll ask the question, is 1 less than 2? Which of course is true. And then we would print out Jane. And then we would add 1 to I, making it 2. And so when we do the final test here, 2 less than 2, which happens to be false, then we skip the body. Okay, we skip everything and we're done. So that is the difference between the for loop and the while loop. When you compare them, you can clearly see that they're doing the same thing, except the major change is instead of having the box creation or the variable creation inside the for loop, we put it outside. Okay, and then we have the while keyword instead of for. We have the condition. We still have the actions being performed. And step 4 is done inside the curly braces, and it has to be the last thing that is done. Okay, so let's switch over. Let's write some code just to see what this looks like. Okay, so I'm going to take the array code from our last session, and I'm just going to use a while loop. So iterate, okay, to go over, to iterate over the items. Okay, So I need to create a box, of course. So I'm going to say int. I can call it I. I'll set it to 0. Okay. And then I will use the while keyword and then the condition. So while I less than size. Okay. And now the actions. So I want to simply cout. Name of the array, numbers. Okay. I. And then skip a line. And the last thing I must do is the increment. So I'm going to say I++. Okay. Okay, let's see what happens. And I don't want to do 4. I just want to do maybe 2. Okay. Compile. Remember, every time we make a change to the code, we need to recompile or to compile again. Now I can execute. Let's enter 12. Let's enter 10. Okay. And those are printed out for me. Okay. So once again, this is the while loop. We can use the while loop in places where we would use the for loop. So again, if I wanted, I could have replaced this for loop with a while loop. Now let's do that. So let's get rid of this. Okay. And I'm going to say, all right, let's create my I. Okay. Now this will cause an error. However, this is a perfect opportunity. It will allow me a perfect opportunity to explain a very key concept when it comes to programming. All right, so let's say while I less than size. Okay. I want to space. I want to ask for an input. Okay. However, once I've finished getting the input, I need to remember to do the increment of the variable I. Otherwise, it would never stop. Okay. As I explained in our class. Okay, so this looks good. Let's see if this works. Okay. All right. So as expected, the compiler, right, the compiler is telling me that I am trying to recreate the variable I on line 17. Okay, and it's telling me I was previously declared on line 9. What does that mean? Okay, so I created I here, and then I tried to create I here again. But remember, as I've always stressed, you can only create a variable once. So I have violated one of the rules. Now you might be asking, well, how come when we were using for loops, I could use int I equals 0 inside all of them and there were no errors? And that's perfectly true. There were no errors. Okay. And the reason there were no errors was because of the idea of scope. Okay. We'll talk more about this as the semester goes along. But what scope essentially says is there are certain parts of your code where whenever you create a variable, that variable is local to that particular area. So whenever you create a for loop, whatever variable you create inside the for loop is local to the for loop. And so no other entity, no other piece of code outside the for loop can see or use that variable. However, when it comes to the while loop, that's not the case, because you notice we don't create the I inside the while loop, we create it outside. And whenever I am creating code outside, okay, then all the other code can see that variable, okay? And that's the problem. This variable is the same as this one, but because they're at the same level, right, they're not inside of any parenthesis, right, it means that they are being exposed and they're visible. And in programming, we can't have that. We can't have two variables with the same name being created at the same time, okay, without one of them being somewhere else. And that's the problem. Now, we'll talk more about this. We'll keep talking about this because it's very important, because it allows us to know and to understand where we can create variables with the same name and where we cannot. And this is clearly an instance of where we cannot. So what do I do? Well, the solution is very straightforward. I'll leave this as I, but down here, since I can't use I, I'll simply create a new variable which I'll call J, and that's what I'm going to use here. Okay, so that allows me to fix the problem of two variables having the same name. I just change one of them to be called J, and I make sure that I use that in all the places that I would have used I. Okay, so let's test that. Need to recompile, and let's run that. Let's say 12, let's say 2. All right, and it works. Okay, so that's something new you've learned. Variables, okay, if they're at the same level, obviously have to be unique. Now, as you can clearly see, if I decide to create a new loop, but this time using a for, okay, I can rightly go ahead and use I again. And the reason is simply because whenever you create a variable inside the for loop, this variable is considered on a different level. In other words, this I is only visible inside this for. So as far as the computer is concerned, when it sees this I here and when it sees this I here, it considers them two different I's. Okay, all right, so just to prove that to you, if I just say cout maybe numbers I maybe plus 10, okay, and end line. Okay, all right, so that's all I'm gonna do. Notice the for loop tends to be a bit shorter, right? Everything we put inside, and we only need to worry about the actions here. All right, so in any case, let's try this out. Recompile. Okay, notice there were no errors. So 11, 12. All right. And so notice we have 11, 12, and now we get 21, 22. So again, this works perfectly as far as the compiler is concerned. This I on line 9 is different than the I have created here, right? They're literally two different boxes. Okay. All right. I'm going to leave it here. Okay. I'm going to leave it here. And I want to move on to the idea of infinite loops, because that's another important topic. And so the takeaway from this lesson is we can use a while loop or we can use a for loop. Okay, using the for loop tends to be easier. It's more neat, meaning that you can pack everything inside here. All right. However, the while loop is used quite a lot, so you will be seeing a lot of code where the person uses a while loop instead of a for loop. Again, you should be comfortable with both because you'll see both in practice. All right, I'll see you in the next lesson where we look at infinite loops. See you then.